As someone who was brought to this world in the 21st century, it's okay if you will assume that the field of clinical psychology has always existed. However, clinical psychology did not emerge as a discipline until the beginning of the 20th century and did not begin rapid development until World War II ended. Between its initial and its current form, the field of clinical psychology changed significantly. In this lesson, we will explain the events that gave birth to clinical psychology as a profession. I will describe the slow but steady growth of the field during the first half of the 20th century, followed by the explosive growth that gave rise to the major approaches to clinical psychology, that is psychodynamic, humanistic, behavioral, cognitive, and systems. This is actually the story of how these approaches came into being. So in this video, we're going to talk about the past and the present of clinical psychology. Now, the roots of clinical psychology extend back to before the field of psychology was ever named, back to developments in philosophy, medicine, and several other sciences. A few of these roots are especially important because they converge and created the field of clinical psychology, though only in embryonic forms. Now, three sets of social and historical factors initially shaped clinical psychology, and we are going to look at that one by one. These factors include the use of scientific research, that is the empirical tradition, the measurement of individual differences highlighted by the psychometric tradition, and the classification and treatment of behavioral disorders that is highlighted by the clinical tradition. Now, historians typically mark the beginning of modern psychology as 1879, the year that Wilhelm Wundt established the first laboratory devoted to studying mental processes in Leipzig, Germany. Wundt was convinced that psychology, like biology, physics, and other sciences, should seek knowledge through the application of empirical research methods. He and others who came after him were determined to study human behavior by employing the two most powerful tools in science: observation and experimentation. Now, the founding of Wundt's laboratory was not the only beginning point for the new discipline. Others in physiology and medicine had been working on problems that were essentially psychological in nature. For instance, Johann Mueller and his student Helmholtz identified and explored the neural pathways for vision and hearing, discovering that addressed discoveries that addressed the question of how physical energy became mental experiences. Ernst Weber and Gustav Fechner showed that people's perceptual experiences changed in mathematically predictable ways as stimuli, whether that may be weight or brightness, changed, suggesting that mind and body were fundamentally connected. Still, Wundt is regarded as the founder of psychology because the advent of his laboratory so clearly proclaimed psychology as a science and became his and because he actually trained many students who went on to establish psychology program in Europe and in the US. One of Wundt's student was an American named Leitner Whitmer. I am quite sure that you have already or that you remember this name because we have talked about him in the last lesson. Now, following his graduation from the University of Pennsylvania in 1888, Whitmer worked on his PhD in psychology with Wundt at the University of Leipzig. After completing his doctorate in 1892, Whitmer was appointed director of the University of Pennsylvania Psychology Laboratory. In March 1896, a local school teacher named Margaret Maguire asked Whitmer to help one of her students, Charles Gilman, who she described as a chronic bad speller. Once a school teacher himself, Whitmer took the case, thus becoming the first clinical psychologist and simultaneously beginning an enterprise that became the world's first psychological clinic. Whitmer's approach was to assess Charles's problem and then arrange for appropriate remedial procedures. His assessment showed that Charles had a visual impairment as well as reading and memory problems that Whitmer termed visual verbal amnesia. Today, these difficulties would probably be diagnosed as reading disorders. So Whitmer recommended intensive tutoring to help the boy recognize words without having to spell them first. This procedure successfully brought Charles to the point that he could read normally. Now, by 1900, three children a day were being served by a clinic staff that had grown into 11 members. And in 1907, Whitmer set up a residential school for training children with intellectual disabilities. The same year, he founded and edited the first clinical journal, the Psychological Clinic, and wrote the lead article, now, which he titled simply Clinical Psychology. Now, by 1909, over 450 cases had been seen by Whitmer's facilities. Under Whitmer's influence, the University of Pennsylvania began offering formal courses in clinical psychology during the 1905, or rather 1904 to 1905 academic year, since clinical psychology at this point was on its way. Now, several aspects of Whitmer's new clinic came to characterize subsequent clinical work for many years. First is that most of his clients were children. A natural development since Whitmer had been offering a course on child psychology, had published his first papers in the journal Pediatrics, and had attracted the attention of teachers concerned about their students. His recommendations for helping clients were preceded by diagnostic assessment, and that also he did not work alone but in a team approach that saw members of various professions consulting and collaborating on cases. He emphasized prevention of future problems through early diagnosis and remediation, and he also emphasized that clinical psychology should be built on the principles that being discovered in scientific psychology as a whole. Lastly, Whitmer got clinical psychology rolling, but had little to do with steering it. He lost influence largely because he ignored developments that would later become central to the field. For instance, Whitmer used psychological tests available to him at that time, but he largely ignored the development of new intelligence tests. This decision was costly because intelligence testing came to characterize applied psychology perhaps more than any other activity during the first half of the 20th century. Whitmer also ignored early forms of adult psychotherapy that would or rather, that would come to dominate the field and virtually define psychology in the eyes of the public. Whitmer remains active, of course, but mainly with functions and clients that have since become more strongly associated with school psychology, vocational counseling, speech therapy, and remedial education than with clinical psychology itself. In short, Whitmer's contributions were significant, but they cannot account for the diversity and the growth that clinical psychology experienced after him. For that, we must look at other sources. Now, a second source from which clinical psychology developed was the practice of measuring people's physical and mental abilities. The importance of measuring individual differences has been recognized for centuries. In his Republic, Plato suggested that prospective soldiers be tested for military ability before their acceptance in the army. In the 6th century BC, Pythagoras selected members of his brotherhood on the basis of facial characteristics, intelligence, and emotionality. And 4,000 years ago, prospective government employees in China were given individual ability tests before being hired. Surprisingly, the earliest development in the scientific measurement of individual differences came in the field of astronomy, anatomy, and biology. The astronomical story began in 1796 when Neville Maskelyne was astronomer royal at the Greenwich Observatory. He recorded the moment at which various stars and planets crossed a certain point in the sky. His assistant, David Kinbrook, or rather, made the same recordings. But Kinbrook's recordings consistently differ from those of his bosses by 5 to 8 tenths of a second. Um, Mascalini assumed that his readings were correct and that Kinnebrooks was in error. As a result, Kinnebrook lost his job. Now, this incident drew the attention of F.W. Bessel, an astronomer at the University uh, of Königsberg Observatory. Bessel wondered whether Kinnebrook's error might reflect something about the characteristics of various observers. And over the next several years, he compared his own observations with those of other experienced astronomers. Bessel found that discrepancy appeared regularly and that the size of the difference depended upon the person with whom he compared notes to. The differences associated with each observer became known as personal equation because they allowed calculations to be corrected for personal characteristics. Now, Bessel's work led to later research by psychologists on the speed of and individual differences in reaction time. Interests in individual differences can also be seen in the early 19th century work of German anatomist Franz Gall and his pupil Johann Spurzheim. Gall thought he saw a relationship between his schoolmates' mental characteristics and the shape of their heads. This notion later led Gall to espouse phrenology, an alleged science based on the assumptions that number one, each area of the brain is associated with a different faculty of function, that is self-esteem, language, or reverence. And number two, the better developed each of these areas is, the more strongly the faculty or function is manifested in behavior. And number three, the pattern of the pattern of over or underdevelopment of each faculty is reflected in corresponding bumps or depressions in the skull. Now, Gall traveled throughout Europe measuring the bumps on people's heads, beginning with prisoners and mental patients whose behavioral characteristics seemed well established. He thought um, he thought that the acquisitive bump was especially strong among pickpocketers and later on more respectable segments of society. Eventually, a map of the brain's 37 powers, according to Gall, or organs, was drawn. People paid phrenologists to have their heads examined, after which they received a profile allegedly describing their mental makeup. Although certain brain areas are associated with certain functions as vision, movement, and language, Gall's claim about the location of functions and about the meaning of irregularities in the skull were recognized even by scientists on this day as spectacularly wrong. Now, individual differences were also central to Charles Darwin's momentous work, Origins of Species. In it, Darwin proposed two important ideas: that number one, variations of individual characteristics occur within and between species, including humans, and number two, natural selection takes place in part on the basis of those characteristics. Now, Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, was fascinated by these ideas and he quickly applied Darwin's notions to the inheritance of individual differences, especially in mental abilities. For example, Galton sought to measure people's ability to make a fine discrimination between objects of differing weight and between varying intensities of heat, cold, and pain. He also developed the association test to explore associative processes. So eventually, Galton set up the world's first mental testing center, where for a small fee, anyone could take a battery of tests and receive a copy of their results. Now, the person usually credited with merging individual measurement with the new science of psychology is James McKean Cattell, also a former student of Wundt. Cattell was one of the first psychologists to appreciate the practical uses of tests in the selection and diagnosis of people. Cattell's experiences in Wundt's laboratory taught him that psychology cannot attain the certainty and exactness of the physical sciences unless it rests on a foundation of experiment and measurement. Consequently, one of his first take was to construct a standard battery of mental tests for use by researchers interested in individual differences. He chose 10 tests that reflect the then prevalent tendency to use sensory motor functioning as an index of mental capacity, and he tested people's performance under varying conditions. He also collected less systematic information about people's dreams, disease, preferences, recreational activities, and future plans. So Galton's method of systematically collecting samples of behavior from large groups of people launched what came to be called as the mental testing movement. Now, Alfred Binet, a French lawyer, scientist, and former student of guess who? Willem Wundt, was another key figure in this movement. In 1896, Binet and his colleague Victor Henry described a battery of tests that measured not just simple part processes such as space judgment, motor skills, and muscular effort and memory, but also comprehension, attention, suggestibility, aesthetic appreciation, and moral values in both normal and defective children. Binet's new intelligence test, the Binet-Simon test or scale, was introduced in the United States, where in 1916 it was revised by Louis Terman of Stanford University. Now, this Stanford Binet intelligence test grew so rapidly in the United States that it overshadowed all other tests of intelligence, including those used by Whitmer. In spite of Binet's warning that it did not provide a wholly objective measure of intelligence, new university psychological clinics and institutions for the intellectually disabled, formerly called retarded, began adapting the Binet approach. Thus, by the early 1900s, psychology was involved in measuring individual differences in mental functioning, and it hosted two overlapping approaches to the task. The Galton-Cattell sensory motor, aimed at assessing inherited, relatively fixed mental structures, and the instruments of Binet and others, which emphasized complex mental functions that could be taught to some degree. Now, each approach was important to the development of clinical psychology. The former, because it influenced Whitmer and helped foster the appearance of the first psychological clinic, and the latter because it provided mental tests that gave the new field of clinical psychology its first clear identity. Now, the third tradition which influenced clinical psychology is the clinical tradition. Now, from the beginning of recorded history, human beings have tried to explain behavior that is bizarre or apparently irrational. Early explanations of disordered behaviors involve possession by demons or spirits. Treatments for such supernaturally induced maladies involve various forms of exorcism, including trephination, the boring of holes in the skull to provide evil spirit with an exit. Now, in the early monotheistic cultures, God was seen as a possible source of behavioral problems. Now, in the Old Testament, for example, we are told that the Lord shall smite thee with madness and blindness and astonishment of heart. Now, where supernatural approaches to behavior disorders were prevalent, philosophy and religion were dominant in explaining and dealing with them. Although they are not prominent in Western cultures today, and in the Philippines for that matter, uh, well, yeah, in the Philippines, a lot of us still believe in supernatural, and especially demonological explanations remain influential in other cultures. Um, Now, supernatural explanations of behavioral disorders were still highly influential when, in about the 4th century BC, the Greek physician Hippocrates suggested that these aberrations stem from natural rather than supernatural causes. Hippocrates argued that behavior disorder, like other behaviors, are a function of the distribution of four bodily fluids or humors: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. This theory, generally acknowledged as the first medical model of disordered behaviors, paved the way for the concept of mental illness and legitimized the involvement of the medical profession in its treatment. From Hippocrates until the fall of Rome in 476 uh, CE, physicians supported and refined a physical or medical model of behavior disorders. Now, in the Middle Ages, the medical model was swept away as the church became the primary social and legal institution in Europe. Demonological explanations of behavior disorders regained prominence, and religious personnel again took over responsibility for dealing with cases of deviance. Even resourceful, or rather ever resourceful, many physicians soon became priests and began treating the insane by exorcising the spirit presumed to possess them. Now, with the Renaissance, the pendulum gradually swung back to naturalistic explanations of mental illness. At first, the treatment of deviant individuals took the form of confinement in newly established hospitals and asylums, such as London St. Mary of Bethlehem, organized in 1547 and referred by locals as Bedlam. Feared and misunderstood by the general public, many undoubtedly still believed the mentally ill to be possessed. Residents were little more than prisoners who lived under abominable conditions and received grossly inadequate care. Fortunately, changing conceptions of mental illness led Europeans and North American reformers in the 18th and early 19th century to push for more humane living conditions and treatment in mental institutions. In France, Philippe Pinel assured in this era of more humane treatment in the form of in the following comment. He said that it's my conviction that these mentally ill are intraceable only because they are deprived of fresh air and liberty. In the United States and Great Britain, movements to improve the treatment of persons with severe disorders paralleled those in France. Benjamin Rush, often regarded as the father of American psychiatry, was instrumental in changing the way institutionalized mental patients were treated in the United States. In Great Britain, William Tooke played a similar role. Both men had one foot in the past. Rush, for instance, advocated the antiquated treatments of bloodletting and a tranquilizer chair for immobilization, while Tooke favored the whirling chair and plunge baths. But both men also anticipated the future. They favored removing restraints, as Pinel had in France. They sought to study mental illness scientifically, and they argued that suffering persons were worthy of respect, kindness, and treatment. Reformers such as Dorothea Linder Dix A New England school teacher campaign for the improvement of conditions for the mentally ill, launched a public information campaign, lobbied legislative groups, and eventually played a role in founding more than 30 states institutions for uh, the mentally ill. Thus began a new awareness of the possibility that mental patients could be helped rather than simply hidden and physically assumed, or rather, and physicians assumed the responsibility for helping them. Now, the role of physicians in treating mental disorders was further solidified when, later in the 19th century, syphilis was identified as cause of general paresis, deteriorative brain syndrome that had once been treated as a form of insanity. Finding an organic cause for this mental disorder bolstered the view that all behavioral disorders are organically based. Now, the notion that there could be no twisted thought without a twisted molecule triggered a psychiatric revolution in which doctors searched feverishly for organic causes of physical treatment for all forms of mental illnesses. Now, new ways of thinking about mental illness require new ways of categorizing it. Emil Kraepelin was a German psychiatrist who, over a 40-year period, wrote and revised the first formal classification of psychological disorders. Kraepelin's main interest was in a careful in a careful classification of mental illnesses, but his career also included participation in the formation of the first state mental hygiene committee in the United States, attending Wundt's summer courses, giving expert testimonies in murder trials, screening soldiers in World War I, writing poetry, and studying Buddhism. Now, Kreplin's classification system is no longer used, but his approach of classifying mental illnesses in terms of observable symptoms is still very evident in the current system of classification, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that is the DSM-5. Now, ironically, the revolution that viewed mental illness as a disease led to the idea that mental disorders might have psychological causes too. In the mid 1800s, a French physician named Jean Martin Charcot found that hypnosis could alleviate certain behavioral disorders, particularly hysteria, known today as conversion disorders. Charcot's lectures were well attended. Among the regulars were Alfred Binet, William James, and Sigmund Freud, and a French neurologist by the name of Pierre Janet. Now, Janet believed that some parts of the personality could become split off or dissociated from the conscious self and produce symptoms such as paralysis. Now, Janet's views anticipated those of Sigmund Freud. Now, whom we all know, and already proposed the first stage of a theory in which behavioral disorders were seen not as the result of organic problems but as a consequence of the dynamic struggle of human mind to satisfy instinctual, mainly sexual, desires while also coping with the rules and restrictions of the outside world. Now, dispute arose over whether Janet's or Freud's work came first, but there is little doubt that Freud did more to develop the theory and thus became far better known than Janet. Now, Freud's theory were first introduced to American psychologists during the 1890s, mostly in journal reviews by William James and James Baldwin. Um, Psychologists with strong interest in the self, the ego, and the dissociated states of consciousness, such as trance, hypnosis, and unexplained memory loss. Now, these theories at first drew less than enthusiastic reactions, both in Europe and in the United States. One doctor called Freud's idea a scientific fairy tale, even, and nevertheless, Those ideas eventually grew to become a comprehensive theory of the dynamic nature of behaviors and behavioral disorders and a detailed description of psychological treatment for such disorders. So it was that idea from a clinical medical tradition ultimately redirected the entire course of the mental health professions, including that of clinical psychology. Now, although the seeds of clinical psychology were planted centuries ago by philosophers and by pioneers in the physical sciences, the roots of clinical psychology did not appear until the middle and late 1800s. The most prominent roots were the empirical research tradition, began in Germany with Wundt, the psychometric tradition began in Great Britain and France with Galton and Binet, and the clinical therapeutic tradition began in France and Austria with Charcot, Freud, and others. Each of these traditions found expressions in the United States, and as we all know, anything, most of the practices that we have in the Philippines have been influenced by that of the United States. And in the U.S., melting pot tradition eventually combined to form a new site specialty in psychology. Now, the three traditions provide a stable base for clinical psychology, much as three legs provide a stable base for a stool. Without any of them, the discipline would have collapsed. Now, with all three, it could grow and support future development, which is what exactly happened. So let's now move on to look at the major approaches in clinical psychology. Now, fast forward to the aftermath of the World War II, clinical psychology grew rapidly, branching out into major theoretical approaches that came to define the field: psychodynamic, humanistic, behavioral systems, and cognitive approaches. Now, each of these approaches is best thought of as a broad school of thought rather than a singular theory. We assume that most students I assume rather that most of you will have or already have a course in personality psychology and in that of abnormal psychology. So our goal here is to describe the basic assumptions and general applications of various approaches to psychological problems. Later on, we will talk about whether or not you should be sticking to just one approach. So the first is that of or psychodynamic approach. As already noted, Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic or psychoanalytic psychoanalysis became a dominant force in early clinical psychology. Subsequent modifications and variations on psychoanalytic theory are known collectively as psychodynamic. All, psych- all psychodynamic approaches have a common origin and all share certain assumptions about personality, psychopathology, and psychotherapy. Freud's psychodynamic theory was founded on the idea that human behavior is derived from the constant struggle between the individual's desire to satisfy inborn sexual and aggressive instincts and the need to respond or respect the rules and realities imposed by the outside world. To Freud, the human mind is an area in which what a person wants to, that is classified as instincts and impulses, must be reconciled with the controlling requirements of what can or should be done, that is reason, social norms, and morality. Now, this conflict often leads to anxiety against which the person tries to build defenses. If the anxiety gets too strong, or if the defenses become ineffective, a variety of psychological symptoms can appear. Freud employed the term id, ego, and superego to represent the aspects of the mind that are often in conflict. Those conflicts, as well as their historical origins, often in childhood, lie outside the person's awareness in the conscious. What clients are aware of and what others see are clients' symptoms, maladaptive ways of behaving, feeling, and thinking, adopted also unconsciously. So, as a way to defend against anxiety associated with historically rooted conflicts. Now, treatments in the psychoanalytic approach is aimed at unearthing the source of client symptoms. Freud compared his method with that of archaeology. The therapy searches for deeper meaning and for uncovering forgotten or repressed memories and unexpressed emotions that lie beneath the overt symptoms. With the therapist help, the clients gradually become aware of how historically rooted conflicts uh, push pushed not quite successfully into the unconscious, have come to be expressed in current experiences. This awareness, called insight, is a central goal in psychoanalytic treatment. Now, as the psychoanalytic approach developed, others expand upon, challenged, and changed some of Freud's original concepts. Later, theorists expand the role of ego, that is beyond being a referee between the id and superego, placed more emphasis on social and cultural values, that is less on sex and aggressive impulses, and explored forms of psychodynamic treatment that were less restrictive than classical psychoanalysis, that is briefer in duration, greater flexibility, and has greater flexibility in the therapist's role. Despite these modifications, however, all psychodynamic psychotherapies share certain basic assumptions. Oops. All right, let's now move on to the humanistic approach. Now, this approach developed as an alternative to to the psychodynamic approach that dominated personality theory and clinical practice during the early 20th century. The humanistic approach view persons as creative, growthful beings who, if all goes well, consciously gives or guide their own behavior towards realization of their fullest potentials as unique individuals. When behavioral disorders arise, they are usually seen as stemming from disturbances in the awareness or restrictions on existence that can be eliminated through various therapeutic experiences. Now, the roots of humanistic therapies are in the clinical tradition, but they also grow from the philosophical positions of phenomenology, which states that behavior is determined by the perceptions and experiences of the behaving person. Phenomenology puts the client's perspective and experiences at the center of the therapy. What about what the client perceives, rather feels and thinks in the here and now takes center stage. Childhood histories buried in the unconscious may have played a formative role, but the client's current experiences of reality, including experiences of the self, are what matters most. Perhaps the most prominent advocate of the humanistic tradition was Carl Rogers, a psychologist who was initially trained in psychoanalysis. In Rogers' view, as the developing child begins to differentiate between the self and the rest of the world, there is a growing awareness of this self, recognition of the I or the me. According to Rogers, all of a person's experience, including self-experiences, are evaluated as positive or negative, depending on whether they are consistent or inconsistent with the child's self-actualizing tendencies. However, these evaluations are not made on the basis of direct or organismic feelings alone, as when a child evaluates the taste of candy as positive. They are also influenced by the judgments of other people. Thus, a young boy may end up negatively evaluating the experience of fondling his genitals, even though the direct feelings are positive, because his parents tell him that he is a bad boy to do so. So Rogers noted, however, that most people value the positive regards of others so highly that they will seek it even if it means thinking and acting in ways that are incongruent with organismic experiences and the self-actualizing motive. This tendency is encouraged by what Rogers called conditions of worth. circumstances in which a person receives positive regard from others and ultimately from the self, only for certain approved behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs. Conditions of worth are usually first created by parents, family, and other societal agents, but they are later maintained internally by the individual. So, people who face extreme or excessive conditions of worth are likely to be uncomfortable if they behave primarily to please others. It may be at the expense of personal growth. And then you have the behavioral approach. The behavioral approach to psychology grew more from the empirical tradition in psychology than from the clinical or psychometric traditions. So, this orientation makes behavioral psychologists inclined to see the cause and treatment of disorders somewhat differently than psychodynamic or humanistic therapies do. In general, behaviorists are more inclined to focus on specific learned behaviors and environmental conditions associated with those behaviors. So they are also inclined to seek evidences of treatment outcomes that are objectively measurable. Although clinical observations are relevant, experimental finding form the basis of the theory and application of behavioral therapy. Now, groundwork for the emergence of behavioral therapy occurred in 1920s when psychologists became interested in the studying the role of conditioning and learning in the development of anxiety. Now, the discovery of experimental neurosis in animals led to research on similar problems in humans. So the most famous of these studies was an experiment in 1920 by John B. Watson and his graduate students. Student Rosalie Rayner, where a 9-month-old infant, which we would call Albert B, was presented with several stimuli such as a white rat, a dog, a rabbit, a monkey, masks, and a burning newspaper. He showed no fear towards any of these objects, that is, but he did become upset when a loud noise was sounded by striking a steel bar with a hammer. To see whether Albert's fear could be conditioned to a harmless object, Watson and Rayner associated the loud noise with a tame white rat. Albert was shown the rat, and as soon as he began to reach for it, the noise was sounded. After several pairings, the rat alone elicited a strong emotional reaction in the child. Now, the conditioned fear also generalized to some extent to other previously neutral furry objects, including rabbit, a fur coat, Watson's own hair, and even a Santa Claus mask. Now, Albert's fear persisted in less extreme form during assessment conducted over a 1 month period. Now, a few years later, Mary Cover Jones, another of Watson's students, investigated several techniques for reducing children's fear. For example, she used social imitation to help a 3-year-old named Peter conquer his fear of rabbits. Each day, Peter and 3 other children were brought to the laboratory for a play period. The other children were selected carefully because of their entirely fearless attitude towards the rabbit. Now, the fearless example set by other children helped Peter become more comfortable with the rabbit, but his treatment was interrupted by a bout of scarlet fever, and his progress therefore was jeopardized by a frightening encounter with a big dog. When treatment resumed, it included direct conditioning, a procedure in which Peter was fed his favorite food in a room with a caged rabbit. At each session, some of which were attended by Peter's fearless friends, the bunny was placed a little closer to him. Now, the cases of Albert and Peter encouraged the application of conditioning principles to the treatment of fear and many other disorders. In 1920s and 1930s, uh, or learning-based treatments for sexual disorders, substance abuse, and various anxiety-related conditions were developed. Now, the term behavior therapy first appeared in 1953 in a 1953 paper that described the use of operant conditioning to improve the function of people with chronic schizophrenia. In the years since, numerous behavioral techniques have been developed for the treatment of psychological disorders. Now, it is interesting that many of the people advocating behavioral approaches were not trained in clinical psychology, but rather in experimental or developmental psychology. However, the applicability of behavioral methods for treating disorders was gradually recognized, and behavioral therapy ultimately achieved its status as a major treatment approach. So, cognitively oriented researchers and therapists view certain cognitions, particularly thoughts about the self, as especially important in the development of psychological disorders. Because these thoughts are usually connected to emotions, they affect how persons feel about themselves and their relationships with others. Cognitive therapists attempt to modify maladaptive behaviors by influencing a client's cognition, beliefs, schemas, self-statement and assumptions, expectations, and problem-solving strategies. Now, the cognitive approach to clinical psychology grew from the more general cognitive revolution that has influenced all of psychology. This revolution can be traced to developments both inside and outside of psychology. The outside influence include advances in mathematics, biology, and artificial intelligence, and especially the development of of computers. Inside influences were those that focused on how habitual cognitive routines, that is, people's programming, were related to behavior and emotional consequences. Uh, practicing clinicians were welcomed the expanded consideration of mental events. Behavioral clinicians had not adapted the concept of psychoanalysis, preferring instead to remain closer to empirical psychology's emphasis on observable event and laboratory research. Yet, it was inconvenient for behavioral clinicians to avoid reference to the client's understanding of their own cognitions. So, the client's belief about the cause of events, called attributions or appraisal, seem to play an important role in their problem. So, George Kelly was arguably the first cognitive clinical psychologist. He developed a theory based on the fundamental assumptions that human behavior is determined by personal constructs or ways of anticipating the world. According to Kelly, individuals act in accordance with their unique set of expectations about the consequences of behaviors, and their major goals is to validate their personal constructs and thus make sense of the world as they perceive it. Now, according to Kelly's theory, disordered behavior results when a person develops inaccurate, oversimplified, or otherwise faulty constructs about social uh, experiences. Much as a scientist will make incorrect predictions from faulty constructs, people are likely to behave inappropriately if their personal constructs do not allow them to correctly anticipate and comprehend daily events. Thus, a man who construes everything in life as either good or bad is going to have problems because not all events and people can be classified this way without distorting them. He may decide that all college students, political activists, and foreigners, for that matter, are bad, and that all children, doctors, clergy are all good. But he will be wrong at least part of the time. He will also be seen by others as close-minded, prejudiced, and a poor judge of character. So his interpersonal relationships will likely be stormy too. Now, another influential figure in the cognitive approach was Albert Ellis, this man right here. Now, according to Ellis, the therapist's task is to attack these irrational, uh, unrealistic, and self-defeating beliefs and to instruct clients in more rational or logical thinking patterns that will not upset them. For example, clients who believe that they are unlovable are likely to claim that nobody likes me. Now, this belief, no, or rather the belief that they cannot tolerate rejection and may break down emotionally is relevant or revealed by the comment, I cannot ask them for that. What if they say no? Ellis advocates or advocated use of strong direct communication in order to persuade clients to give up the rational ideas with which they indoctrinate themselves into misery. Other versions of cognitive therapy, like that of Aaron Beck, provided detailed accounts of how specific types of thoughts influence specific disorders such as depression. They are also related to theories that describe the connections between cognitive processes and social behaviors. Lastly, you have system approach. Now, a number of alternatives to the psychodynamic, humanistic, and cognitive approaches developed during the latter half of the 20th century. Many of these alternatives share the view of people's behaviors developed in and as a reflection of the relationship systems in which they live. These approaches may well call group or system approaches are quite diverse in terms of their theoretical foundations and methods, but they all emphasize interventions directed at a group or pair of interacting people rather than just an individual. So, one of the earliest of these approaches is embodied in group therapy, which was first practiced at the beginning of the 20th century in Boston by Joseph Pratt. Later, stimulated by the shortage of professional personnel around the time of World War II, group therapy became a practical answer to a surplus of clients, typically soldiers and veterans, and a shortage of clinicians. Now, group therapy grew in popularity because, especially in the 1960s and the 1970s, and has since progressed to the point that it's now regarded as a valuable intervention in its own right. So, around the middle of the last century, family therapy developed as a clinical child psychologist realized they could treat children's behavioral problem more effectively if parents were involved. Some therapists began to look at children's disorders as symptoms of family dysfunctions rather than as individual child's problems. In Family Diagnosis and Approach to the Preschool Child, Nathan Ackerman and Raymond Sobel um, argued that the focus of diagnosis and treatment should be the family rather than the child. The focus was on the family as a system itself. Now, uh, the foundations of psychodynamic and behavioral approaches to clinical psychology developed well before World War II. But after the war, when treatment became a central activity to clinicians, these approaches surged. Now, other approaches to treatment soon developed, that of humanistic, cognitive, group systems, and hybrid approaches such as the cognitive behavioral approach. Now, these schools dominated clinical psychology, shaping theory and practice during the field's most rapid periods of development. And they continue to exert strong influence today. So, lastly, we will talk about whether you should stick to a specific approach or not. Now, an approach to psychology, or rather to clinical psychology, provides clinicians with a framework to guide thinking and practice. It helps them narrow the vast range of variables to a few manageable ones. Now, by doing so, clinicians can then more easily note relationships among those variables. They can propose and test explanations for how behavior develops and become problematic. Now, an approach is also like a region of the world that develops on its own dialect. Now, that dialect eases communication among those who share it, so the term used by a particular approach become a kind of professional shorthand. making communication among like-minded professions more efficient based on their shared language and explanations. Clinicians adapting the same approach can then develop assessment methods that efficiently provide data about the variable of interest, develop treatment techniques targeted for specific problems or persons, and conduct research to discover the levels of effectiveness of those interventions. A clinical approach guide all these activities. It can serve as a compass and a guide. Ironically, a specific approach to clinical psychology can also become a set of blinders. Some clinicians allow their favorite approach to so completely organize their thinking about behavior and mental processes that their view become fossilized, leaving them rigid and close to potential valuable ideas associated with other approaches. The approach themselves are partly to blame. That is because many of these newer clinical approaches appearing over the years have defined themselves partly by the rejections of assumptions uh, held dear by other approaches. Um, Clinical trainings often compound perceived differences among approaches through the influence of professors and supervisors. Graduates of programs that favor one particular theoretical orientation may come to advocate for the approach over all those other more or less automatically. In short, taking a consistent perspective can evolve from an asset to a liability if it produces such a narrow focus that other points of view are overlooked. When this happens, clients are poorly served and the profession is diminished. So, fortunately, though, many problems associated with taking a specific approach to clinical psychology can be reduced by A, avoiding the overzealous commitment uh, to, to it that fosters conceptual rigidity, behavioral inflexibility, and semantic narrowness. And second, evaluating the approach according to rigorous scientific methods, and revising the approach when the data demand it. Understanding the and appreciating other points of view can act as an insurance against a narrow-minded uh, nest that could be detrimental to the clinicians and the clients alike. Now, I hope that even though you have your own favorite approaches, you will remain open minded. And this leads to the importance of talking about what is called as eclecticism. Now, many clinicians say that they do not confine themselves to a single approach. Instead, they tend to adopt aspects of two or more approaches that they find valuable and personally satisfying. This position is described as eclecticism. Estimates of clinicians identifying themselves as eclectic range from near one-third to two-thirds or more. Whatever the percentage is, it's clear that eclecticism is a favored approach among practicing clinicians. Now, the advantages of eclecticism are clear. People open to a variety of approaches avoid the conceptual blinders created by allegiance to one theoretical model. They are also in a better position to adapt changes in thinking or practice when research show that they should. But being eclectic might be easier in theory than in practice because approaches in clinical psychology are so varied that it is difficult for trainees to gain in-depth knowledge of multiple approaches, and the effort to do so might be more confusing than enlightening. A recent article that, addressing this question was entitled, "Is that an unconscious fantasy or an automatic thought?" Challenges the learning uh, challenges of learning multiple psychotherapies simultaneously. Now, even even the time required to develop solid conceptual grounding in several theories can be prohibitive, meaning that few, if any, practicing clinicians or researchers have an encyclopedia knowledge of the field. So today, clinical psychologists and clinical psychology training programs are looking for new and better ways to integrate what the various theoretical approaches have to offer, searching anew for common elements in the causes of disorders and in the effectiveness of treatment. Now, some have even suggested that the era of traditional theoretical orientation is at its end, and that a new and unified integrative approach is at hand. But change is not easy, and integrative approaches are very much works in progress. Now, but the same is true of any other scientific field. It's often difficult to recognize the shortcomings of our most beloved theories and to look beyond them to find better ways to understand and apply what others have learned. However, true clinical scientists wouldn't want it any other way. So, there are a variety of approaches to clinical psychology, and we have surveyed quite a number earlier. An approach is necessary for clinical psychology to limit the number of variables they attend to and study. Yet an approach can also do as much harm as good if clinicians become overzealous in their allegiance. Common sense and empirical research suggests that each major approach has contributed to clinical psychology. When viewed from the perspective of several decades, the three most noticeable trends in therapists' selection of approaches are the decline in the popularity of the psychodynamic approach from its dominance in the mid 20th century to its leveling off in the past 2 or 3 decades. Number two, the increase of the percentage of clinical clinicians selecting cognitive and cognitive-based therapies. And number three, the increase in the percentage of clinicians favoring eclectic and integrative approaches. So this ends our lesson in clinical psychology's past and present. My name is Dex Kamitan, and thank you for watching.